Today, I am very excited to welcome Ken Shipley to the show. Ken is a co-founder and driving force of the Numero Group, which has been digging in the most diverse set of crates since 2003, unearthing, recontextualizing, and amplifying diverse and unheralded voices and labels of all genres through engaging storytelling and immaculate packaging. A to Z has been working with Numero for several years on their LP, CD, and merch projects. In this episode, we will touch on Numero's history with a special focus on a project 30 years in the making, the exhaustive defining document simply entitled Sequoia, which comprises a whopping 25 distinct 7-inch records and 136-page book documenting the 90s era emo, punk, noisecore scenes that were scattered throughout select US cities. And with that, Ken, I want to welcome you to the show.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Absolutely. So I just want to, start at the top of the show, just mentioning to me, I view Numero really as a more than a record label. I view what you've done and your other co-founders really as a brand that allows people to dig into a genre, a label, an artist that maybe really has been undocumented or unheralded to a certain extent. And through your storytelling and packaging and obvious love for whatever that scene or genre is, you really help bring these voices to the fore. So, I just want to maybe start there and see if that, is clearly sort of a guiding mission when you started the label, and if it's something that still very much guides you today.
Well, I've never been into like one genre of music. I've been into one genre of music very explicitly at various intervals in my life, but I've always been a bit of an omnivore, to steal another record label's name. And when we started Numero, I was coming out of running an indie rock label, and I'd worked at this very large label called Disc, and I'd worked in their catalog department for a little while, and so I had a number of different sort of like musical and visual perspectives that I was drawing on when we started this whole thing up. And the main thing for me was that like it was important that there was no sound, but that there was an aesthetic, and like that aesthetic could carry you across hundreds and hundreds of records, and that you would know when you saw that N that it would mean like a trademark of quality. Much in the way that, when you go back through history and you would look at like a Blue Note LP that would have their record label logo on the cover, or more specifically to what we were doing, the Actuel label out of France that was like enormously inspirational to me in terms of visual identity for the label. And so like there was never going to be a sound. And it's funny because I think for the first probably 5, maybe 10, maybe even 15 years of the label, Numero was a soul label in most people's minds, even though we'd made many records that were not soul records in that time. It's just, like the most popular things that we'd done were like, Capsule label, or the Syl Johnson box set, or, there's The Light on the South Side, and there's a number of different sort of like, important Black American records that we worked on that I think defined the early years of Numero. But simultaneously, it's like, I think a lot of people forget that our second record was a French-Belgian electro samba record from 1982 that was as far away from Capsule, probably sonically and aesthetically, as you could get. And, we launched those two records together on purpose. And it's to show that it was something bigger than just a soul reissue label, because the Ace had been doing such an incredible job. Kent, more specifically, their label over there, had really documented so much incredible soul music. Soul Jazz and Jazzman and Honest Johns were doing just a bang up job on covering American soul music, and so it didn't seem like there was necessarily a need to have another all soul music focused label. And we just I've always been guided by our own tastes and principles.
And where does the packaging sort of fit into equally telling that story?
Well, I mean, to me, I've always been the kind of person who's judged a book by its cover. I've bought plenty of records just from the cover. And funny enough, the Antenna record, when I first saw it in the bins, I thought the cover was beautiful. I looked at it and I said, "Man, what a gorgeous record! I will absolutely take a chance on this for $3.99." And while records are certainly a bit more expensive than $3.99 these days, uh, I do think that I haven't strayed very far from that principle, which is it's like if you make something that's really beautiful, you're a lot more likely to get somebody who has no idea what it is to pick it up and put their ears on it. And so, like, I always wanted to have sort of a feeling like you were coming into the same amount of objects as we were, right? So, like, if you look at our first release capsule, they didn't have very much. There wasn't very many photos. There wasn't very many assets for us to work with. And so what we ended up doing was photographing the records, and not just in the way where it'd be like, oh, let's just put a donut of the 45 in a booklet, but to put the 45 in a really cool looking sleeve and to see it, kind of like in an almost gallery environment, as if you like pulled all these things out of somebody's basement and arranged them in an aesthetically pleasing way. And that philosophy has never really swayed. Now, I think we've gotten to become better designers. We've obviously gotten into deeper catalogs with much more visual assets to work with. And so depending upon what the project is, it could go a number of different ways. If you get flooded with incredible images, well, man, sometimes it's just hard to put together the record and leave something out, but then other times it's like you don't have that many images and that limitation sort of requires you to make something great out of something very little. And so, like I've always been a sucker for making a great cover and knowing that would be like that first driver. And so when I go into any project, I sort of like, after we've done sort of deciding what the music is going to be, my next step is to start thinking about what is this package going to be.
Does that start from the cover?
Always starts from the cover. I want to see what like the most amazing defining image of that scene or artist or whatever it is we're covering. I ideally, we'll have something that's just, the best thing that we have will sort of go forward. But oftentimes, you're working with, depending, the artist or something, it's like you want to be able to put the artist on the cover or many of the members of the group on the cover. And it's sometimes difficult to be able to do that, right? Because there's plenty of groups that we've worked with that don't have a single photo to their name. And then that becomes like a whole other series of challenges that unfold to get to the heart of making that great record. Sometimes requires you to expand your idea of what a record should look like.
And in time, that could then in turn create sort of an iconic new image of that artist or band or the scene that you're trying to document.
Well, like that Acid Nightmares record right behind you on your,
Yep.
What is that? Left shoulder, right? Your right shoulder.
Yep.
We had that done by a guy who, we explained to him like, hey, this is the idea. We want to do a blacklight record that could glow in the dark, that focuses on, hard rock, drugs, sex, pills, whatever. And, like we gave him these very, very specific parameters. And then he came back and with these sketches of just like, here's what I think this world looks like. And now it's funny because we've sold, I don't know, 15, 20,000 copies of that record. And it's one of the records that when people are going through Numero, they look at and they find it to be one among the most striking things that we've ever done. And again, it's a representation of this, non-existent hard rock scene of the late 60s and early 70s that we sort of wanted to put an identity around, right? And it's just like, it's more than just long hair, it's something bigger than that. And like anytime you get an opportunity to sort of do that, you want to like push it as far as you can. The original pressing of that came with a flocked background, like it was all the black was flocked, and there was, I don't know, 8 different colors or something of it. And it's like if we can push the cover art on these things so far that again, when some person who that type of imagery speaks to them, maybe they're into hard rock, maybe they're into metal, maybe they're just into weird looking stuff, you can pull them in without even having them listening to a single note. And that's when like that I know that I've succeeded with coming with a great record.
I mean, I feel like you've really done that better than most labels of the past, 15, 20 years, is creating that indelible cover image and backing it up with really captivating copy on the marketing sticker. And yeah, I'm sold. I want to pick up this record. I may never have heard of one of the bands or anything, but I want to learn more. And I think you guys do it better, really, than almost everybody else out there.
I mean, all that really comes from just like looking at a lot of records over the years, looking at people who've designed records over the years and who've like understood that like maybe a record label might want to have its own identity in its cover, you know. And I mean, like when I was working at Rykodisc, for instance, they had this really simple thing. All the covers were different, but they had this sort of Coke bottle green jewel case that tied the whole thing together so that when you were in the bins flipping through CDs and you saw that Coke bottle green jewel case popping up against all that sea of clear plastic, it sort of meant that there was something interesting there for you to dig towards. And I always wanted our covers to sort of be seen as just like, there's no track listings, there's nothing, you don't know anything about this. The hype sticker and the cover sort of tell you everything that you need to know. If you need to get in your phone to figure out anything more, you got that. But like I think the austerity of it was sort of intentional to get people sort of questioning what they want to see in an album cover, what's important to have in their collection.
Absolutely. Yeah, I certainly remember those Ryko disc CDs of the 90s and, really incredible bands like Sugar and Morphine and even the Bowie catalog. And you really were unified with that green, which they had patented, I believe.
They did, yeah. It's funny. I remember before I worked at Ryko, I was working at another record company, and there was this band on Discord called Blue Tip, and they really wanted to do that Coke bottle green jewel case, and they went out and tried to find it and realized that not only had the jewel case color been patented, but the pigment dye that had gone into that clear had been patented. So there was no way in it. Such a brilliant little move, right? Like from the beginning, they did that so early. They recognized that there was this easy way for them to stand out in a market that was going to be extremely crowded. And that's how I felt about the reissue business when we launched the label in 2003. It was just like, there are so many people doing this thing. What are we going to do that's going to set ourselves apart from the pack?
It goes back to branding, really. It's like, how are you going to brand yourselves and make it that captivating, unifying, consistent voice that people will respect and continue purchasing products, even if they don't know about the music? Is there any packaging that you look at today or any ideas like that? Like, I mean, no one has the scale to make a custom colored jewel box anymore, but is there anything along those lines that like, hey, if I had my way, I would love to make something that would be from a media standpoint, almost a patented sort of an item?
It's funny. I'm constantly looking to the world for ideas for like what to make. And I'm going to pull out a couple of examples of
Yeah.
things. Like we did this series called The Cabinet of Curiosities that was really about pushing the boundaries of what records could be and what records should be. And so I'm just going to kind of show you a couple of them so you can get an idea. Like this one, it's denim. It's got a pocket with like a little note in there. I mean, like real denim wrapping it. So I wanted it to look like a pair of jeans that somebody might wear. And the music inside there sort of reflects that. This is an 8-track that you can pull out from the bottom. I'd actually open them up, but they're sealed. We did a floppy disk for this one.
Yep.
We did a
I believe we
cigarette
worked
pack
on
for
that. Yep.
this one.
Yep.
This one's a yearbook from the 60s. This one is a matchbook. This one folds into a pyramid. This one is a film canister box. This one's a working planisphere so that you can see the stars in the sky. And this one's a Nintendo game. And like all of those sorts of different, those ideas that we talk about of like, like pushing into, like different sorts of packaging aesthetics are things that I'm constantly looking for in the world. And it's like, I spend an inordinate amount of time at flea markets and vintage malls and that sort of thing, looking for relics from the past that need to be advanced into the present so that people can sort of like understand them in a different context and maybe appreciate them from a different context. But also, like, in doing that Nintendo game one, that's a nod to a place that I come from, a place that maybe other people come from, and like builds an instant nostalgia for the package and maybe an expectation for what could be on the inside of that. But
And
they're all austere in that same way, right? It's just like, keeping it mysterious and different and weird so that the person that's diving in kind of has no idea what they're getting into.
but they think they have somewhat of an idea. I mean, in a Nintendo package, surely, there's some connotation that there's going to be, a game or electronic component to whatever their, the aesthetic of the packaging is.
Absolutely. I mean, the aesthetic of that packaging is going to drive people towards what they think it's going to sound like. And then what you do on the inside is surprise them, and take them to some places that they didn't know they wanted to go.
Which is music, which is where the music comes in.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, how much of that is the visual versus music, and where are you personally like devoted, or is it everything? Are these projects like from the outset? Is this your vision? And I know we're going to talk about Sequoia, but in some of these other projects you just showed me, were these jobs that you were like, hey, this is my idea, and I'm going to execute the vision as well as compile the soundtrack to that vision?
Well, like on these 10 records, there was kind of a larger team of people. It was like I think we started it in 2019 or 2018 maybe. And it was just this idea of like making records more interesting again. We wanted to do a series of compilations and we were sort of like looking at different vibes within the catalog that could all sort of sit together, So it's like, hey, this music sort of all sounds not the same, but sort of fits under an umbrella. What can we put around it to sort of like give it an identity and not have to worry about like covering a very specific scene or anything like that, and also not having to make it like so generic as a genre compilation, and that they could be a little more fun. And so, like my partner Rob, he drove the pyramid one. He had this idea for sort of like a turned on futuristic black 80s underground music, and then we worked for a really long time to sort of discover what that package would be for each one of these things. I mean, that series took, I don't know, 5 years to complete, and each one of those things was just just like moving the ball a little bit forward with like our fantasies and our dreams about what record making could be. There's also like we worked with a ton of incredible designers over the years who've helped us like not only build these things but also like give us ideas around them. So it's like I might come in and be like, hey, I want to make a record that's a matchbook, but not have an idea for what's going to be on the cover of that matchbook or what's going to be on the interior of that matchbook. And then you obviously, when you have a great team around you, they can populate those records with their ideas, and then you slowly you approach it with like, how can we fit everything into this, and then you shave away to what the reality of the package is going to be.
For sure. And how many of these sort of projects are ongoing at any kind of one moment, whether they're about to be released or you're really in that still creative infancy of putting these things together?
Well, I can tell you right now, there are a little over 150 records that have not been released that are in various stages of production. We release about 75 records a year. And there might be things, for instance, like just today, we added 2 things to the 2026 schedule that we hadn't even considered before, but that we wanted to push forward. And so it's just like when I say that 150 number, it's like, oh, you'll be through that in 2 years. But some of these projects might take 5, 7, 8, 10 years to develop. And then, as we're acquiring new catalog along the way, things get pushed into the schedule. Like, you're always kind of looking for a mix of difficult things like the Blondie or the Husker Du or the Soul Music of Illinois, combined with doing some layups that you can get out really quickly. Making a single LP that doesn't have any bells or whistles is obviously a lot simpler, and you've got to balance out that release schedule so that you're not spending all of your time in dreamland, but also like using your record making muscle on an everyday basis to just kind of churn out great records that people want to own.
Yeah, we talk about hitting singles and doubles all the time. So I would imagine that analogy is somewhat apt here. Is everything can't be a Blondie or a Husker Du box set every day.
No, and I don't want to work on those every day, you know? Like sometimes it's nice to be like, God, I worked on a record this week and it was over at the end of the week. And it was like, I just, you know, like I wrote the sticker, I approved the label copy or whatever, you know, whatever the parts that I was involved in. And I didn't have to agonize over every decision, every, you know, font, every, you know, piece of the marketing text. And, you know, like when you can, you know, get into a little bit more of a machine mode, it just, you know, it makes that process of records um, certainly like less daunting, maybe a little bit less rewarding, however, you know, like because when I make something really big and crazy, you know, like it's to me, it's like the ultimate flex of making records for 30 years, right? It's just like, well, if you've been doing this for a really long time, you've seen all the tricks, you've seen thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of records. And, you know, like I'm constantly inspired by the world around me and wanting to kind of push it into my own craft. Um, and it's just like a joy, for instance, to look at something like Sequoia and be like, that is the product of somebody who has, you know, looked at records and has been making records for a very long time.
For sure. So let's get into Sequoia. So, like, if you had to describe what it is, I don't want to even begin to describe it. Please do.
It's I, I don't really ever use the word definitive for things because it's hard to be definitive in this life. You know, you buy a catalog and then you put out a record, and all of a sudden two other masters show up later, and it's no longer definitive. So I would not say that Sequoia is the definitive document of the post-hardcore and emo scene, the first 12 years of post-hardcore and emo, but I think it's the first document of that scene that has covered it in such depth, and it's like really honors the sort of aesthetic, you know, values of that scene and the sort of, you know, sonic values of that scene in a way that nobody has ever done. I would compare it to something like Nuggets, which I think for a lot of people was their first entry into underground garage music. That was certainly an inspiration as we sort of talked about this thing. It was like, how could we do that, but for this scene? And, you know, what does this scene look like? And the great news is that I came from it, right? So it's just like not only did I experience it, but I owned all the records and I had lots of flyers and I had lots of friends who owned records and photos. And, you know, we'd been sort of compiling a lot of these bands over the years on different standalone records. And so it's just, it came to be, you know, for us sort of like the numero document of this scene.
Were you playing in bands? Were you releasing records at this time? Like, maybe you can like take us back. Like, where for you was the scene, and what was your involvement in it?
So this like particular strain of post-hardcore kind of erupted in the mid 80s in DC. I was a little young for that, but by the time about 1991 rolled around, I was a 14-year-old kid who was figuring out what part of punk was interesting to him. And I always sort of, you know, shied to maybe a more like emotional state of music, like things that were like deeply powerful. I loved Fugazi. I followed Discord with, you know, like a reckless abandon at one point. Um, and so getting into all of this music for me was like pretty, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? That doesn't matter. You know, it was like a really important period of time in my life, as your teenage years and the music you listen to in your teenage years tends to be, right? And so I started putting on shows when I was 15, and about a year later, I was like deeply involved in this scene in Cupertino, California, which is where I'm from. And we'd found this, you know, a couple of venues and this strain of music, and there was just all these bands from California doing this sort of, you know, I would say a spin-off of the DC sound, although I think they made it their own. I mean, you have the San Diego scene, which was like Heroin and Antioch Arrow and Klickitat and then you got, you know, your LA scene, which had Still Life and Shroom Union and Evergreen, and then in, you know, in our Bay Area scene, it was like Indian Summer and Fuel and John Henry West and, you know, Allure and Mohinder, and there, you know, there's just so many great bands that were sort of like tied together, like within like a 6 or 7 hour range of one another, that a circuit developed. And, you know, I saw that circuit and was part of that circuit sort of spinning into a national scene. And again, like once you start hearing a band and they get connected to another band, and then somebody sends you a record, or you heard of that, and then the picture started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so when I think about, like what I was doing back then, it was very local, but at the same time, I was also selling records from around the country. I had a distro box in the back of every show, and was, buying records from Little Rock, Arkansas, and Paramus, New Jersey, and, all sorts of other little burgs that were doing something similar. And trying to kind of cross those records together and find that audience. Because you're talking about shows where there was 60 kids might be a huge show. Like I've been to plenty of post-hardcore shows where there were 15, 10, 5 kids. This was a very small scene, but extremely dedicated. So as I was saying, I was, putting on shows, distroing records. And then the first record that I ever made came out in 1995, which is called Eucalyptus. That'll be important in a second. And it was essentially a document of 1994 and all the band, not all, but many of the bands that I had come through Cupertino and had been I put on shows for. And every time the band would come through, I'd be like, hey, I want to put out a record. I would love to make this compilation. Do you have any extra songs? And then staying in touch as the way that scene was, which was through the mail, maybe through having a dialer and using the payphone, whatever it was to sort of stay in touch with folks. I slowly but surely cobbled together that first double 7-inch, which was called Eucalyptus, which is, just the first tree, which was my first label, tree in the forest of millions. And I always saw it as sort of being a defining document of that era of my life, and wanting to showcase this really cool scene that happened before I got too old to appreciate it.
That's pretty impressive.
Now, that record came out when I was about 18. I just turned 48 on Friday. And Sequoia is the 30-year sequel to Eucalyptus in many ways, because it's I'd always planned to put out another record, but then, your taste changes as you get older. You get into different things, and emo, especially, I think, is a young person's music. I say that not to say that you can't enjoy it in your 40s or your 50s or your 20s or your 70s or whatever, but it speaks loudest to you when you are in that angsty place in your life, when everything is falling apart in your family, or you're getting beat up in school, or you got some girl that broke your heart or whatever. There's that music. Just it hits so hard when you're a kid. But I always thought that, that these records were really just incredible pieces of non-commercial commercial art. And down to the packaging, the aesthetic of chipboard and hand screen printing, and little inserts everywhere, and clip art of out of copyright or in copyright bits of work that sort of defined what this thing was supposed to look like. And I was looking at my records as we were developing a bunch of other projects, and starting to kind of see all of those singles in a box together, that we were picking out. And I was like, man, this is an incredible box of records. If you owned this box of records, it would be a starter set for getting into this music. And that's kind of how I looked at it. I was like, what would be a great way to showcase the first decade of this music from a more underground perspective? It doesn't have Rites of Spring on it. That's okay. It's not supposed to. It's not supposed to be definitive. It's supposed to be a numero look into this world, and more of an underground world. Somebody else has already done Moss Icon. That's okay. We don't have to do every record for it to have it be a successful and impressive package. The idea should be that you can reach into this box, and they're actually 27 7-inches in it.
Well, I 25 in the box or 27 in the box?
27, because there's 2 double 7-inches in that box. And, but if you pulled out any one of those records, you'd have a starting place to go somewhere else.
Was the goal to have that many 7-inches in the box?
The goal was always to have 25 groups in the box. It was originally going to be a 25th anniversary of Eucalyptus. It just took a really long time to come together, and making 30 in the box just seemed maybe more daunting, and the price obviously just keeps going. But it's also, and I use these analogies lightly, but I really was sort of inspired by how Marvel builds a universe, right? So it's we'd already made an Indian Summer LP, which is to me like one of the most defining emo and post-hardcore records. We've already worked with Unwound in great depth on a series of box sets. Sorry, I'm looking behind me. To not get too lost. But we'd already like done a bunch of these really kind of like the Hated, for instance. We'd done some pillars of post-hardcore, and what I really wanted to do was make something more like the Avengers, where it's like we've had these standalones that you can get into, but if you don't know where to go or you don't know where to go next, this box set should sort of be like tentacles out into a bunch of other little scenes and worlds for you to discover. And so it's like we did all these records. Sequoia is the Avengers, but then after that, there's going to be a bunch of other records that spread off from there to take you into the next place.
Well, thank you for explaining that. Is this the most records you've put in the box up to now?
Actually, no. The most records I've ever put into a box is 45 singles in a single box, which throw it off for the kids. This is a thing called Eccentric Soul Omnibus that we made in 2012. 2012, I think is the one came out. And this one, which was like the first really impressive box set we ever made, it's 45 underground soul groups from America packaged in, like an old style 45 box that you would get at a thrift store in the 90s for 50 cents. And Sequoia, in a way, is also a sequel to that box because we've always wanted to come back to doing a 45 box, but we didn't want to just repeat ourselves. We could make another soul box. We could do modern soul. We could do disco. We could do whatever. But to challenge yourself is to do something outside of, the things that you have done and to constantly be zigging when the world expects you to zag. And so I didn't want to repeat myself with making a second omnibus, although in a way, this is the second omnibus.
Got it. And you took this package and you have done chipboard and you have really, as you say, kind of harkened back to, did these records come out originally as chipboard or like what was the DIY aesthetic of many of these records? And really what was probably the pressing on some of these originally? Very, very small. Yeah.
It depends. Indian Summer is a chipboard laden, 7-inch that came out in 1993 or early 1994 that was wrapped in a cool little piece of chipboard and hand screened. But, that sold anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 copies. It's one of the biggest records of its era. But there are plenty of other things in there like the Lazarus Plot, which was pressed in an edition of 500 that now trades for $400 because it's so scarce, right? And I do think it runs the gamut, but the defining characteristic for me across these records is a handmade DIY element, and chipboard was cheap. You could go in and buy a ream of this stuff for almost nothing. You can screen on it. It's sturdy, it's a very malleable little product that you could work with. And there's plenty of other records that are just fold over photocopies and, maybe there's some just hand screened on a Bags Unlimited white 7-inch jacket. There's, it's sort of like how can we use the world that's around us, but do it through a DIY way, because nobody who is making these records is how do I make a cheap, shitty record? They were just how do I make a cheap record where what I put into it is my time, right? So the values are are an aesthetically driven thing rather than a financially driven thing. Because when I started making records, I would spend, probably 4 or 5 minutes per record putting something together, and you start adding that time up. You start realizing it's the investment is the time, and that the whatever the decisions you made about the pieces that you were using, whatever paper stock or photocopies or stamps you were gluing to it, all that stuff, you tried to kind of get as cheaply as possible, because when you're 17 or 18 or 19 or 20, what you have in abundance is time. And what you don't have in abundance is money.
Well said. And really at that time period, the 7-inch and even 10-inch to a certain extent was very much the currency that bands and labels really kept putting out new music and taking ads in zines. And as you say, Rick, really running mail order operations and spreading their music and vision to the world. And so I think it's very appropriate that you have all these 7 inches in this box. But I find probably your 18-year-old self couldn't have imagined that you would have put together such a lovely box.
There would have been no way to have done this in 1995. Like this was, I didn't have the resources to do it, and that's kind of the joy of getting older. Sometimes is it's like you get a lot more information about the world, but then you get a lot more resources to work with in that information. And like to me, when I made Sequoia, I was like, what would be the record that I would make in a perfect world in 1995? What would be on it? What would, like if Ken Shipley that, like was looking at and buying all these records, if he wanted to make this, what would he make? I think I succeeded in a lot of ways. I mean, it's hard because it's like, I'm my biggest critic, like probably any artist is you look at your work and you're like, oh, I would have done this, or I would have changed that, or, like I would have put this different song in here. And we'll see, let's see when I'm 58, how I'm feeling about it, or 78.
So can you talk about the trip that you took to see
Yeah.
this vision come to life?
Yeah, I've been to a lot of pressing plants in my life, but I knew that it was sort of like the mother pressing plant. Like, it's so big. I mean, and I brought this idea to your associate Patrick, and I was like, hey, I would really love to go there and show people what it's like to get a Numero box set made. What would that be like? And he's like, man, they don't let anybody into that place, like not with cameras. And I was like, well, look, I don't care about like showing any secrets or anything like that. Like they can look at it, that's fine. But what I really want to do is take people on a journey, to be like, you buy box sets from Numero all the time. Here's what it actually takes, here's all the people that are involved. And I was like stunned by how massive this operation was, right? Because there's like something like 2,000 people work for that company worldwide, at least 1,000 working in that plant. It's the size of a small village. There's 32 buildings, I think, spread across the entire area. It's wild. Like when you walk in the front door, they've got this sort of scale model of the grounds, so you can see while you're waiting for somebody to let you through the barrier, like this is how big this thing is, and this is where you're going. And it was just like kind of unlike any other place that I'd been to, because there were so many things happening there. You go to a record pressing plant and you see records coming off of a press. I've seen that. I've been to probably 10 pressing plants and seen that. But the cool thing there is it's like, not only do you have the records being pressed, you've got the print being done there, you've got the labels being done there, you've got the assembly being done there, you've got, like they can do lacquering, they can do mastering, they can do, all these different things that are really hard to put under one roof. And I think only, and take this with a grain of salt, but it's just like, since they've been open since the early 1950s, it's like they've had a lot of time to build this thing. Because at one point they were doing CDs and tape replication and all sorts of other things as the market has changed that they've managed to sort of be involved with. And I don't know, to me, the idea was to come and just show one of our records in their world, and like see, how it looks against the background of this like giant manufacturing plant, and it's just like, we're going to make a DIY record at the biggest record pressing plant in the world, which, like there might be some people out there being like, man, why wouldn't you do this at all these small places and put it together yourself? And it's like, well, when you're operating at scale, it's really hard to do things small. So with Sequoia, it was like, how can I do DIY at scale?
It is they are very DIY if you think about it. As you say, everything is made under one roof. It's just at that ginormous scale.
Yeah, and it's crazy. It's just like, I remember watching these like 25 women putting together the box set one by one, and I kind of like went down the line and was like, here's this person, here's how they put it together. They're all wearing little white gloves. They got this blue table to keep the dust off. It's like a blue tablecloth to keep the dust off, and just everything is so intentional, like they're really like, they care about what record comes out on the other side. And look, there have been great records pressed at GZ. There have been miserable records pressed at GZ. You can say that about any plant,
Absolutely.
But what I think is so like cool is that, they're operating in a way that just nobody else is operating. And to just go there and like see that and experience their little world, I thought was so special. And I was like deeply appreciative of their willingness to let me be kind of zany and, like go, like, I remember there were just like different things. I was like, what's up this ladder? What's around this staircase? And they were like, like they were cool with us, like looking at stuff and like, peeking and asking a lot of questions. And God, their English was just so much better than my Czech. Like I was just so surprised by like their ability to be able to answer almost any question. About what we were trying to do. And like they really took like amazing care of us. And I didn't realize, and I don't think they realized how many records that we'd made together over the last like 25 years almost that Numero has been in business. But like it's funny, I walked into the conference room when we were like waiting to get started, and one of the giant boxes they had on the wall was the Blondie that we had done. And I was like, oh, I made that record. And you did? And I was like, yeah. They didn't know because we'd done it with Universal,
Yeah.
and it was just like one of these things where it's just like they had no idea how deep Numero was there. And it was cool to kind of like show them, like, hey, we're like actually like a client that not only cares about the process of what you're doing, but like wants to figure out how we can challenge you and make you even better.
Yeah, for sure. And they're definitely that company that we lean on to make those challenging, impossible box sets. And I look at a project like this, the quantity, the really various packaging components from the book to the slip and slash box to all the jackets. And I was like, no one else could do this, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even that too. It's like there's a paper inner sleeve that goes into the chipboard jacket. Then those, I mean, it's just like all these little things, all the different paper stocks that are in the colors, the spot colors that are running throughout it. Being able to go and like press check that while it was coming out. I mean, I actually found an error. And that was like one of the things that was so great about going there. It's just like, God, if this would have showed up, I would have been so bummed. But like, I spent not even that much money to go over there, look at these records as they were coming out, quality test this thing, and know that the box set that I'm putting into the ultimate user's hands is going to be a work of art.
So do you think you'll want to do more sort of hands-on, in-depth exploration of the production of your projects? Is that something you think the fans of Numero are interested in?
I don't know. I mean, I try not to repeat myself. That's like a really important thing for me is I don't want to do the same things over and over again. So I don't know like when I'll do anything that's like this, but I never say never. And again, I'm always looking for that next great challenge. And when it finds me, I'll run towards it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I've pretty much asked the questions I wanted to ask. I did want to talk a little bit about the merch that you guys have been doing, which I love. And maybe you just talk about that, like from the basic T-shirts, hats, totes, all the way to like something like the Duster Cat. How does that come about? What is the focus there? Is it an extension of the brand?
I've never thought of Numero as just a record label. I never wanted us to just be a record label. And I know for the longest time, mostly what we made was records, but I kind of always saw us as a musical company, that worked in music in a number of different things, whether it was books or beanies or trucker hats or whatever. It's like finding ways to express your fandom is like what my aesthetic goals were for this label. And like, I don't really believe that like a 17-year-old kid wants to bring an LP to the skate park. But what I do know is that if they wear a Duster t-shirt to the skate park, they can tell people that they're a Duster fan without actually having to like display anything. And so like when we were doing the Stratosphere campaign, for instance, we did the Stratosphere tote. We did the Stratosphere lighter. That lighter, it's just like imagine pulling up to the smoke sesh and you're popping open this Duster lighter, and it's just like if anybody else had seen Stratosphere on TikTok or wherever, it's like they know, and it's like an aesthetic representation of your fandom. And that's what I'm always like trying to go towards with whatever products that we make. That disco jazz hat that's sitting up behind you, I sold so many of that hat, and in a lot of ways, it's a like a
I love this.
Yeah. I mean, and look at that shit. It's like that's the camo one inspired by the Walls campaign. But, we had done a number of different things, in that world and on disco jazz and a number of different hat styles. It's like I can't tell you how many thousands of those hats that we've made. Because again, it's just like it says something about who you are. You're into disco, you're into jazz, cool. You're into both of those things, you're into all kinds of music. Maybe you're actually just really into Rupa, but you don't know how to tell people you're into Rupa. But like we were over in Record Planet in the Netherlands right after that Prague trip, and it was just funny to see how many people just gravitated towards that hat. Like it's just a symbol of something. And to me, it's just like once you can take something and pull it out of the record world and just put it into like the regular world, it has an opportunity to have a life well beyond the boundaries of, music.
And that's how you see the merch is just another way to further extend whatever it is that you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, but again, it really comes back to the fan.
The
Like
fans.
my goal has been to like give that fan a way to represent themselves, and people meet music at a number of different levels. Not everybody wants to own $100 box set. Not everybody can afford to own $100 box set, but a lot of people might be content with owning the t-shirt version of something to express that fandom and, know that maybe they just listen to it on Spotify. And I'm okay with that. Like to me, the important thing is that we're connecting with people on like where they live and how they, whether it's how they want to dress or what they want on their coffee table or, whatever. I want to be able to give people the opportunity to express themselves and their love of what we're doing in a number of different ways.
I think you've done that in spades. So again, thank you very much for your time and your insight. And we're very excited to work on this box and so many other packages for you, and look forward to this getting released.
Thanks so much for having me. Another 150 in the queue.
Excellent. Music to my ears.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ken. Take care.